Hello.
Hey everyone.
Welcome to Happiness Hunch. We are Lynn and Mike, and on this channel, we share the hunches that we have in this life. And today...
That lead to happiness.
That lead to happiness.
That's why we call it Happiness Hunch.
Yeah, because we're in search of happiness, and we're always developing theories on how to get there faster, get more of it. So today, we wanted to talk about discernment, specifically the discernment of truth. I am often passing off articles, YouTube videos done by experts, and knowing that when I pass them off to Mike, they're sort of going to go through this rigorous gauntlet. And I'm always curious to know, is it going to pass? Is it not going to pass? And so today, we just thought we would talk about tips and ways and his gauntlet, the things that he thinks through on any given, bit of information. Or topic. So, what do you think?
Okay. Well, one thing I've noticed over the last, whenever the web went live and the exponential increase of information that we have access to now is that we increasingly are just inundated with what I call information overload. And what I would also call sort of the democratization of information. So, when I was a kid, there were just like a few voices that were the experts that gave everybody the information they needed to know, which, had its good points, but also had a lot of limitations because people could control information and give us false information to indoctrinate us to do things that, we wouldn't do otherwise, right?
So it's kind of good to have these different, we can hear all these different voices, and we have lots of opportunities to glean from different voices. So that is a good thing.
It is a good thing. But now everybody has to become an expert in everything. And that becomes very difficult to discern because you hear so much information about every single topic under the sun. And what is difficult about that is it's like, how do you sift through all that? How do you wade through it? How do you know what's true? How do you know what's false? And one of the things that I noticed is that, early on, I was more ready to believe whatever people said. And then over time, different information would come out that would contradict what I had heard earlier. And then that was the latest thing. And then a couple of years later, new information would come out. And that would, pass up the old information. So, you're always on this treadmill and always trying to figure out, well, what's true, what's not true, what do you accept, what do you believe?
And it is true. We always need to be open to constant discernment. I mean, you always want to be open to the truth. I mean, that's something we really strive to do. So.
Yeah, and you often will find truth where you least expect it and from the voices that you don't necessarily think have anything to teach you. Yeah. So, what I have put together is a list of 8 tips. 8 tips. I could probably come up with more, but 8 sounded like a good number. So 8 tips for trying to wade through the information overload from the web or just wherever, going into Barnes & Noble and looking at an entire bookstore full of books.
Self-help books and everything else.
Like
right.
How do you know what to believe and what to read and what's worthwhile and what isn't,
right.
etc. Okay, so tip number 1. Tip number 1 is, and I think this is probably one of the most important ones, and that is to really lean into common sense.
What an original idea!
I know. Well, this is the thing. I think that common sense is kind of scarce today.
Yes.
And
my dad always talked about common sense. In fact, I would feel like I was a nobody if I did not use common sense. Right? That term came to mind all the time growing up, and I heard it a lot.
Right. So, and part of the reason why I think that common sense is kind of scarce today is because there's so much information that rolls over us all the time. People become very passive, and they just kind of absorb information and don't think very reflectively or critically on what they're hearing. But even more importantly, most people just don't think about their own experience, and they don't pay attention to what's going on around them and what they're experiencing in their own life. And you can actually learn a whole lot of things. So, one example of this that I always go back to is when I was younger. I think I've talked about this on an earlier video, but I struggled with low blood sugar very severely when I was younger. And so I was reading some things about it. and I decided to go to a doctor to get tested, and for my my sugar levels. And I went to this doctor, and this doctor very summarily told me that there really is no such thing as hypoglycemia, that it was all in my head, and that was very distressing. But I remember asking the doctor. I said, I just don't understand that, because every time I have things that are sweet and sugary, I feel really bad. And when I don't have sugary things, I feel pretty good. So common sense would tell me that there was some correlation or causation between having sugar. Now, it took me a little time to get to the bottom of it and understand fully what was going on inside of me. But the doctor, the expert, the professional was telling me something that just completely contradicted my common sense.
Did not align with your experience at all.
So I learned a lot in that experience. So that's tip number one, is lean into your common sense. And in order to develop common sense, which is a virtue, by the way, you have to pay attention, and you have to have your eyes open, and you have to watch what's going on in life and in the world and around you, and pay attention to those things, and you can learn a lot and glean a lot from that. You can acquire this virtue of common sense. Okay, second tip is to always check for bias. Oftentimes what people say to you or what people deny is based upon how they feel about the people that are giving the information.
That's personal.
Yeah, so in other words, they don't want to listen to what another group or a person who comes out of a certain point of view has to say. And as a trained Thomist, I remember I was very struck when I was studying St. Thomas Aquinas' writings, and he was, he's a preeminent Catholic commentator on Scripture and philosophy, and he was oftentimes quoting and citing Muslim scholars who were commentators on the philosopher Aristotle. And I was very struck by that when I came to realize how much he did that. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of cool, because Aquinas really pays attention to finding truth wherever it seems to show up, for him. He didn't always agree with everything they said, but he used them as an authority on Aristotle. So I think that was interesting. So checking for bias, being open to other perspectives, people of different groups, different, tribes. You can learn a lot from just listening to other people's perspective.
Right.
Tip number 3, always be very careful when people express something with inordinate emotion, whether that is excessive enthusiasm or anger or frustration. A lot of times people
Cussing even.
Yeah, a lot of times people are trying to convince you of something without actually giving you reasons to believe what they say. What they're doing is they're just expressing what they believe or their opinion with very, very strong emotion, and there's really not a whole lot there, but a lot of times we can be taken by that, and we can be convinced by what they're saying because they're so passionate about what they're saying. Now, there's nothing wrong with being passionate about what you're saying, but you have to make sure that what they're saying has substance to it, and actually there are real reasons to believe what people are saying. Right? So be careful of emotivism. All right, number 4, always be wary of people who speak in absolutes. Anytime someone says that something always or never or it's only or it just has to, etc., you have to be very careful. It's not to say that there aren't some absolutes, like, for example, in morality and ethics. There are definitely some absolutes. But most of the things that we deal with in this life are not absolutes.
A lot of gray area.
There's a lot of gray area, and life, existence, the world is a very complex place. And so we have to be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of buying into what someone's saying when they speak in absolutes. Again, people can be very convincing, and we like things to be black and white because it's easier for us when everything is black and white. But it's very dangerous because so often when we think in black and white or we think in absolutes, we miss so many of the subtleties and nuances of the way things really are in reality. And so we just have to be discerning and sifting of that. All right, number 5, always be leery of people who are trying to sell something for the sake of some form of personal gain. And that personal gain can come in the form of making money. That's the most obvious one. So you always want to follow the money trail. One of the things that we learned along the way that I thought was very very telling was some of the decisions, some of the politics around food production that we've learned over the years, where certain studies led to certain conclusions, where suddenly this food group was bad and we should never eat it. That would be saturated fats. And what we learned along the way is that there was a huge profit motive that was pushing that agenda, because the vegetable oil industry was very interested in making a lot of money and pushing the saturated fat.
This happened in the sugar industry as well.
Yeah. So back in like the 60s and 70s, so suddenly there were all these diet theories that were all about, eating,
cigarettes is another one.
drinking
Tobacco.
vegetable oils. Yeah, that we were told for a long time that smoking cigarettes are fine, and we heard this about vaping recently. Vaping is fine. And now suddenly these studies are coming out saying, oh, it's really bad for you.
So much.
So oftentimes when there's a high profit margin, there's an addiction to sell and try to convince people of. Or sometimes people just want to make a name for themselves, or they just want to be a celebrity in some way. And so they'll tell you things so that you keep listening to them. So
there are good businesses out there. So we're just saying to look for that.
Yeah. Right. There's nothing wrong with making money. That's not what I'm saying. Right. But you have to just be discerning that when someone has something to a big profit to make, you have to be careful and make sure that what they're saying is really true, and there really is the benefit. What was the commercial we saw? It was about a fabric softener that could turn a completely worn out shirt into a brand new shirt.
The V-neck was all crumpled up and all distorted, and somehow this softener was going to bring back this fabric's vitality.
And make it look brand new.
It's like, what? Yeah.
And I almost bought it, but then Lynn elbowed me in the ribs and said, that's ridiculous. That doesn't work. And I was like, really? Like, it's so convincing. Anyway, marketing and advertisers do this a lot. Okay, number 6. Always be careful of what I would call mega theories. And that is there's always a temptation to come up with the theory that explains everything. And probably the most obvious ideology that fits this description is socialism. I'm going to give my bias away here. I'm not a socialist. Socialism is such a ridiculous theory because it's a theory that tries to explain all social relations. And right out of the gate, you should be suspicious of any social theory that tries to explain every social activity, or a theory that's gonna correct every problem.
Right.
And that's socialist.
As human beings on this earth, it's way more complex than that.
Yeah. So if you just do this, all of our human problems will be solved. No. And socialism is probably the most. It's like a virus. It just keeps coming around again and again and again. And part of it is it just sounds so good.
It does, because it is simple. So the simple part of it sounds good, but the reality is it does not work. You really can't do that successfully.
Yeah, right. So it's a mega theory that tries to explain all things. And, does that mean that there aren't elements of socialism that don't have some merit to them? Well, no, of course not. I mean, truth, where truth is found, there is truth. So it's not that there, isn't, there's no truth in any theory, because then nobody would believe it. But again, a mega theory tries to explain all things. I think sometimes too physics falls prey to this, where certain theories of physics try to explain the entire universe and cosmos, and it's like the longer we go down this journey of discovery, the more we realize there's just not a theory that explains everything. We just aren't that smart. And even if there was a theory that explained everything, I'm not convinced that the human mind could contain that theory. It just would be far more complex,
could handle
or
with lots of nuances and all kinds.
So that's number 6. Number 7, very related to the mega theory, is to avoid or to be suspicious of any excessive reductionisms or oversimplifications. A good example of this is oftentimes there are voices out there in our culture that say that only empirical evidence can verify truth. So only the scientific method is the only way that you can know. Yeah, so if you can't stick it under a microscope or measure it in some way, it can't be true. It's just something we make up in our minds. And really, that's just not true. There's a lot of things that we can verify through other methods and through other experiences and observations, which actually cannot be measured empirically. Like, we all know that friendship is a real thing, but you can't really measure friendship. And when you try to, you end up realizing that what you're measuring is not really friendship, but some other thing that you're trying to map, or
maybe a component of it, but not.
Love, justice, these are things, these are truths or realities that we know, but we know in different ways than the empirical method. So that's a very common example of a reductionism, or of a reductionism or an oversimplification. Okay, so that's number 7. Number 8 is conspiracy theories. So a lot of times people try to explain things by appealing to a conspiracy theory. And here's a good one that I heard a while ago that made me laugh. You probably look up in the sky and on a clear day and you see chemtrails from airplanes. And obviously, when I was a child, I think it's true. We never saw these chemtrails. They're clearly putting...
Something going on.
There's something going on there. They're putting chemicals into the air for some reason. But the theory I heard was that there was a conspiracy with the Russian government, and they were putting chemtrails into chemicals into the atmosphere so that they could throw storms and sabotage the United States and create storm events. So I'm listening to this. Now, obviously, it's ridiculous, but what was so surprising to me is I couldn't believe how many people actually believe this theory. And again, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Russians really are throwing hurricanes and storms at us.
But there's nothing wrong with waiting on the decision on that discernment and waiting for more information, or
I think there's some kind of weather experimentation, atmospheric science going on there. It's probably not good for us, but I just am so skeptical that there's some grand conspiracy going on. The
Russians. Yeah, I don't
or
know.
Just
maybe
even our own government, honestly.
Yeah,
I just, so that's, I mean, again, I think conspiracy theories, always be leery of someone that tries to explain something by means of some grand conspiracy theory. And I hate to say this, but maybe this is too cynical. But in my opinion, humans just aren't smart enough to coordinate on that level of, collaboration. I mean, not that there aren't some collusions out there. Right. Certainly there are. But I think sometimes the degree or the expanse of conspiracy theories is so grand that it's just ridiculous. So anyway,
everybody would have to tell and believe the same lies and get all that stuff straight every time, and I don't know,
be in perfect communication and never get caught. So anyway, so those are the 8 tips. All right, 8 tips for discerning and weighing through all of the information that we get out there on the web. So by way of conclusion, I would say here are some things that we can do that are some good practices going forward so that we can get to the bottom of things, okay? So first of all, don't ever be afraid to suspend your judgment and be patient with weighing through evidence, okay? Probably the number one way of getting to the bottom of information is where you find a convergence of evidence from multiple sources that for different reasons and different methods and different ways are converging on the same conclusions. That's a very good sign that you're probably getting to the bottom of something. Also, test things, pay attention, experiment a little bit if you can, and dig around, do your homework, read multiple sources, different viewpoints, different voices, and be willing to listen. I think one of the biggest things that we all can fall prey to is different forms of self-deception and dishonesty, where we only want to hear what we want to hear because it happens to agree with us, and something is true because it happens to confirm or
we're kind
our
of
own bias.
Or we're kind of in a camp of thought, and we get so entrenched in that we lose our openness, and you really every day you just want to be detached because you want to be able to embrace anything that comes at you with new eyes and not be so in these camps of thought, so that you can really discern truth, and the goal is to experience as much truth in this life as you can. So you do want to be open to it. Instead of 10 years later finding out, I was completely wrong. I just threw that aside, never gave it a thought, and I wasn't open. So,
and it's hard work. I mean, God gave us a mind for a reason. It desires truth. We want to know what is real and what is not. But it's hard work, so we have to take the time and have the patience to get to the bottom of things. And then I think finally, we kind of have an obligation to share what we discover and learn on any level of our lives, whether it has to do with health, whether it has to do with morality, whether it has to do with religious conviction, politics, family life, whatever. I think that once we have some wisdom, we should share it, but we should also share it in a way that is not over-imposing or burdensome on other people. Forceful.
Discern us too. Discern this whole, run it through the gauntlet.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, so those are our 8 tips on how to wade through information overload from this information age that we live in today. So thanks for being with us and listening. Go ahead and register your comments below. Be sure to like us and subscribe to our channel, Happiness Hunch. We're just always trying to share with you the little hunches and tips that we've picked up along the way through the course of our lives, and hope that those are a benefit to you. So until next time,
take care.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye.